Hey everybody. Happy Memorial Day weekend. More on that later. Um but I'm here to do a review of The Secrets of Hillsong, Sins of the Father, season 1, episode 3. Um I just want to say that the reason why I'm reviewing this is because I am so intrigued by the ways in which people seem to come together to cover shit up. And the one thing that keeps playing over and over and over again in my mind, and I read it somewhere years ago when that R. Kelly stuff really, not when it first broke hell, that was back in 2000, but I mean, maybe like 2018 or something. Remember when it was just kind of seemed like it blew up the spot again? And somebody wrote, probably a black woman, who said, who you defend says a lot about you. And that's played over in my mind, particularly around this. So this was the thing that got me interested in the first place when I was watching this randomly on Discovery Plus. So apparently, according to this documentary on FX, apparently you can't live in Australia and not hear about the Hillsong Church. Well, shit. Australia is like what? The size of Texas, maybe? Barely. Anyway, so there was a 2012 town hall meeting that this member of parliament set up. So people come in, tell you what their problems are, whatever, whatever, whatever. So the man they interviewed spent 3 years in Parliament fighting for sexual abuse victims. Now I'm not sure how often they get elected. I don't know all those details. Particularly those within institutions like the church. And he explained like that a lot of the attention had been on the Catholic Church at that point, and rightfully so. And the Catholic Church is the largest entity across the world as far as the Christian religion. But he was like, this isn't just a Catholic thing, and it's not, and it's not. So he said honestly he only expected a few people because it's such a sensitive subject, but he felt like it was worthy of looking into. And he said the next thing he knew, tons and tons of people. They had to add chairs and even ran out of sitting space. And just, I don't know why my head went back to like Baptist revivals when they would do that in church. Never mind. Anyway, so multiple families and individuals got up and told their story about being victimized. So he was even shocked at the level of interest, so on and so forth. So the Vanity Fair journalist says it's hard to report on Hillsong as a church. Clearly, this shit has been happening since 2012. Because its board of directors is actually handpicked by Brian Houston, who's over the church. He was like, they're not transparent. They make people sign NDAs. So you get locked into those contracts. If you do say something, you try to blow the whistle, that's your ass, right? Um, and the thing is, when you do that, what are you hiding? Now, I understand why celebrities have those. I understand why high profile people, like, I don't know, the Obamas, for example, or the president, some people like that, I get. Um, but I get real concerned when those kind of things start to be the norm in churches. Now, granted, you know, um, they're in Australia, so their rules are different. We can't act like they're the nonprofits in the U.S. and there's certain things that have to be explained. But anyway, so we get Brian Houston's deposition. The man who's over Hillsong. What is he being deposed for? Well, and this is what I remember from Discovery Plus. So he's describing his background in life, and we get deeper into the Hillsong Church that wasn't always known as Hillsong. They changed the name to keep the brand going so people wouldn't look it up and find out all this bullshit I'm about to tell y'all about. So, picture Sydney, Australia. Remember how Sophia used to do on Golden Girls? Picture Sicily, 1928. Anyway, so Frank Houston, that's Brian Houston's father. Okay, stay with me. Came to Sydney, Australia to start a church. Okay, we've heard this kind of story before. So apparently they had a membership of 1,000 people within a year. And they were like, across Australia, there's plenty of small churches, but they don't get that big. But this got big. And there was a man named Jeff Bullock, who we got at the end of the episode 2 last week. And Jeff Bullock was apparently an incredible musician. And Brian really enjoyed the role of music in his father's services. This was something he was drawn to. He came up with the name Hillsong. Jeff Bullock did, who was the musician. He just said, well, it's a lot easier to say than whatever Christian Life Center they were using, the name, whatever. Brian Houston, though, they show him, and I think I've been trying to figure this out too. they show him early on. You know, he has like a mullet. He has those weird glasses that are reminiscent of like, you know, child molesters wearing them. They're 80s kind of glasses. I shouldn't say that. I'm talking about his glasses. I don't know about him. All right. But they were like, he wasn't very charismatic. He was lanky. He had no rhythm. They were having services that looked like square dances. And they were like, we honestly didn't expect him to go far. And I was curious too because there was nothing really charismatic about him. Even as I watch him, I'm just like, why the fuck are people so drawn to him? Like I don't get it. I just don't get it. So Brian Houston, all right, this little trip. Remember the way the Afrikaans people, the Afrikaners, came over from South Africa to study racism in the United States. Well, Brian Houston basically comes over to study charismatic religion and prosperity gospel and how to exploit people in the name of the Lord. All right, he comes none other than the capitalist United States. All right, so in 1989 he came over and he studied the gospel approach in the U.S. So he's learning from like televangelists and people who said if you give money to the church and to them, God will bless you with money, prosperity, and health in return. And it's no sense in us acting surprised. Plenty of people exploit the gospel for that. So they were showing all the ways that what's now Hillsong, we're learning to profit off using God as a marketing tool. Because I want to be clear about this. Because I don't. This is not a church. Okay, this is a corporation. Like from writing books to selling music, and it's all coming back to Brian Houston board of directors, the inner circle, right? They hire consultants to figure out how to get more money in the church and line their pockets. So the consultants aren't coming in. They're not inviting theologians to help train other ministers as the church expands. How can we pressure people into giving? He learned that from the good old American tradition. Now, one of the things I did notice was how these preachers were white. Their audiences were majority white, by and large. I saw one black man that they featured. And when they were talking about these mainstream pastors, and we know that there are plenty of black ones too, but what I mean is every time somebody has a bad experience at church, particularly black people, it's a black church. Like, black people do not have different denominations, okay? The AME church, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, is not the same thing as the Black National Baptist or the Black Progressive Baptist. Like, there are different denominations, okay? There's not black church entity, okay? And people always go, yeah, it's the black church, or that's how preachers do their congregants. These white people can have multi-million-dollar businesses across the world, scamming people and taking the name of Jesus Christ and misusing it. I want you to note how they have no problem making sure that makes its rounds in black circles and abroad. Or these, like they did when, what's his name? I never read it. I think it's Eric Jerome Dickey, when he was talking about how one of the places he went in church was where he found to download people. And then white people, and I remember because I went to white schools and hearing teachers kind of talk about it. And it was like this kind of smirky laugh, like, yeah, that's what happens with those black churches. Like, it was that kind of shit. Okay. And then we find out this is the whole game. See, they don't tell us their business. We always telling ours. Anyway, but shit do need to be exposed like this. Anyway, so Carl Lentz, we get him for a little bit. And he says he learns a lot from Brian Houston. Carl was also, in many ways, this is according to the people, on the documentary, and even from what I can tell, he was much more charismatic than Brian could ever dream of being or even pay to be. Okay, like Brian can't hire enough consultants to make him like, yeah, why wouldn't you want to hang around this guy? Fuck him. All right? And I think that's where his resentment for Carl Lentz came. Now, do I believe Carl Lentz is a charlatan and a scammer and a liar? Yes. Do I believe he was called to preach? No. And I was taught at an early age, you don't play about that. You don't go around deciding whether people are called or not, and you judge a tree by the fruit it bears, so on and so forth. But he was not called. Okay? The point is, though, the reason why I think he got kicked out of this corporation is because Brian Houston got jealous because he has something that he never had, and that's charisma. Anyway, so we get the background of Hillsong, 1983, so we're in the 80s. Christian Life Center, Brian Houston founded this church, and they were like, they had pretty strict boundaries for young people. And that sounds more like a Pentecostal approach to me. I mean, the Christian religion does. But I'm talking about the outward talking about sex and what's wrong and bad. You know how that goes. But lots of religions do that. That's probably not fair. So the youth group was about restricting your sexual desires and holding yourself for marriage. And so one young lady got pregnant who was unmarried, but she was 20. So that's what I'm saying, young lady. And her partner was 19. Okay. So over the age of 18, it's not like, oh, it was a 35-year-old and a 15-year-old, nothing like that. And she said at the time she went to the church for help. She said, I realize now that that was a very foolish decision. And they told them to stand up before their peers when they went to talk to the preacher or whatever. Stand up before their peers and apologize for what they did, which was essentially have sex, and she got pregnant. So in other words, having sex and getting caught by the evidence you're wearing, which is your baby. And they had to apologize. And the woman said she was just really ashamed. I'm thinking to myself, yeah, 20, you're probably scared to death too. And everybody was uncomfortable when they did that. She was like, I could see people looking down around at the ceiling, like nobody wanted to even look at us. And she said, I was physically sick throughout the pregnancy, and which isn't unusual for some pregnant women, particularly in the first trimester. But she was like, it was like the stress of it all. It was not having support, not being able to go back into the church. And she was like, that was my life. I didn't have a life outside of it. And that's part of the game with any of these controlling environments. They take up so much of your time, making you believe it's about God and you're doing work for free. Which, and don't get me wrong, volunteering in real churches, I get it. Volunteering in these corporations that's taking in millions is kind of like suspicious. But that's what they do. They isolate you from other people who don't think like you. So when something like this happens, you fuck up royally. You have nobody. You have to kind of beg to be back in their circle. But she didn't. She wasn't able to do that. So Kevin Brett is this guy's name. He has two first names. Is Laura Lentz's dad. Okay. Now, and Kevin Brett from the gate was friends with Brian Hughes. Remember, Laura Lentz had grown up with them. That's why she was so disappointed when they kicked Carl Lentz out of the church and her. And, well, they forced them to resign. Anyway, so Kevin Brett, when he was asked to co-pastor with Brian. And they asked him about the situation where this woman was being interviewed. And she showed her face. She wasn't doing it anonymously or anything. And they said, did that happen? Like, did you really make two young people like that go before the church and admit all this? And they asked him about the situation very specifically. And he said, well, if he was the senior pastor, which he was, then I was wrong and I was out of order. It was a real half-assed apology and no real accountability because he says he doesn't remember. I was like, do you not remember because y'all made people do this so often? Or is it that you don't? That seems like something that would be very hard to forget. Just saying. All right. He then goes on to say, and we're talking about Kevin Brett, that he didn't really see people as individuals as he pastored the Hillsong Church. He saw numbers and crowds. He said, I have a lot to answer for in my, regular life. So I don't think he's associated with the church anymore, or at least not to the degree he was before. And I was thinking to myself, you sure do. And you can begin with what you just said, how wrong you were, and your association with numbers and crowds. So that already lets you know. The association with numbers and crowds means money. That's why Laura Lentz can talk about how her childhood was so perfect and she had an ideal. Well, yeah, she was in the inner circle. She didn't have to experience what the regular parishioners did, who, may not have been making a lot of money and were coming in, giving their money, and then being asked to get up before everybody and, that kind of shit. So I was like, anyway, never mind. So there's a whole lot of people that need to get their just due and have already started at this point. And even then, this is just the beginning. And no, I'm not going to be as careful as I would be, like I said before, under different circumstances with these people. Because these people, I'm not here for it. And Lord can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know I'm right. Are not called by God. They are people using God and exploiting the Bible for personal gain. It's a marketing tool. Okay? And nothing comes of it. It's different. Even if you say, oh, well, people exploit you when you walk in the store and you pay a whole lot of money for a pair of sneakers. They do. But when you pay the money, you get the sneakers. Okay? It's different. It's different. All right. So Frank Houston, getting back to him, the original. All right. Started his career in 1950. So they're giving us the background on this, right? So this is what I mean by who you defend says a lot about you. So Frank Houston started his career in 1950. Ooh, my leg fell asleep. 1950 in New Zealand as a pastor. So he found out, well, he found what he was finding was that people would follow him and do what he said. And that's really what he wanted out of life. So clearly, this is somebody who didn't have a lot of friends, who was probably socially isolated for whatever reason. And he liked attention. He liked being able to control people, so on and so forth. He looked like every other weirdo I saw on Lifetime that was usually the villain. But anyway, um, and he started ministering or his entry into ministry at the Salvation Army had a boys youth group where apparently they had a religious leader, and it was Frank Houston. And when I heard that, I said, oh shit, here we go. uh, uh, and I hate that it's like that. As soon as we hear something like single sex and there's a boys youth group and there's a school involved, or they're boarding, they're away from their families, they don't have a lot, they get exploited. And I think I watch these things because I'm always interested in how these situations become what they are. Because I remember when the Sandusky situation happened, I remember watching CNN and the reporter explained that the average pedophile has 230 victims before they're caught. And that's just what we know. And that's scary to me. That was horrifying to me. And first of all, I didn't even know they had no Salvation Army in New Zealand. I thought that was an American thing, but whatever. And I was like, here we go. So Lower Hutt, I guess Lower Hutt is the name of the church that he's going to start. But I guess I'm bothered that it's not always, but oftentimes poor children, black children, Latino children, people who don't speak English well, people who have disabilities often become very easy targets. Why? Because the police don't typically protect them. Why? Because they don't have money to go and get lawyers. And they become easy prey for these kind of people. And it's disheartening. Anyway, Lower Hutt was the name of the church Frank Houston founded. Don't ask me why. I'm just okay. And at the time, there was not a large church movement. People were explaining in New Zealand. It just wasn't. But he wanted the church to grow. So, I mean, I guess there is potential there because a lot of people don't necessarily go to church in large numbers. So maybe you can get all the membership. I don't know. But he was able to bring people into Lower Hutt. And they said he was a leader who was very forceful as a leader, like aggressive. He shamed people, he humiliated them. Sound familiar from the story before? From Brian Houston's co-pastor? Yeah, like father, like son, like friend. Anyway, they said he would throw cushions and water at people. I said, cushions? Huh? Anyway. So people were like, well, of course they wanted to be with him. They wanted to be with him by themselves. And this guy was like, well, who wouldn't want to be next to God? And so he had managed to associate himself or brainwash people into basically believing that he was so anointed that to be close to him is to be close to God, right? And I was like, this cult shit is real. So they asked Jeff, this is the former musician who said everybody turned their back on him and he was responsible for making the Hillsong music what eventually became. And they asked him, they said, well, did you ever, even as you were working with Brian Houston, did you ever hear any rumors about Frank Houston? And so he kind of asked, he was like, rumors? Like, you heard them people. And he was like, well, he always seemed to be around young boys. Right? Now, if somebody said that, I think now we've been conditioned because there's so many documentaries like this to think it. But I also kind of wonder, as like a preacher or a pastor, you could, be around young kids on a regular basis, but always is probably concerning, and always of a particular sex may be concerning. Um, I mean, as a teacher, yeah, I'm always around kids, but at work, like, there's it's work. You know what I mean? I don't know, but that in particular, I don't think those kind of rumors would take hold. Not that rumors can't start from anywhere. Like, he always seems to be around young boys. Seems like there was something loaded if that was a rumor you kept hearing, right? You know what I mean? Like, somebody wants to say something more, but they don't know how. So Frank went on to start churches in all these other cities, right? He's essentially building a corporation, making money. And he likes attention. So what they later found was that there were rumblings in the undergrowth, that's what they called it. And that Frank Houston, um, there were rumblings about his sexual abuse of these boys. And that Frank Houston, instead of addressing the congregation or saying, yes, I heard, and we're moving forward, trying to throw it off, he ran from the rooms. He went on vacation. He just went on vacation for like 2 weeks. Just act like it didn't happen. See, that's how you know somebody guilty. But then again, Eddie Long was too, and Eddie Long came out there talking a bunch of bullshit. And I will never forget watching that on the news and him saying something about Goliath, and watched all them black people in that church stand up and applaud that man when he said something that didn't even make no damn sense. And I was like, this shit is embarrassing. That's how I felt at the time. I still feel like that. Anyway, in 2014, after that town hall meeting, okay, like 2 years after that town hall meeting, and remember, I told you the senator in Parliament, he had taken it forward. So, Australia decides to have a royal commission, and they decide to open up a governmental investigation into the child abuse that had been happening in these religious institutions and throughout, the country. He said the narrative had been so much around the Catholic Church, and he was like, and rightfully so. He said, but there were still others, especially Hillsong. So that was the whole point about saying you can't be in Australia and I hear about Hillsong. Now, a man who was anonymous said in February 1970, and to me, this is sad because he's recalling being sexually abused by Frank Houston over 40 years ago. And he still feels the need to be anonymous. It's the level of shame, I'm sure, and harassment with a church that powerful. I mean, I don't know if they're being harassed, but I would guess the fear of being harassed, should I say. So a man who was anonymous said in February 1970, Frank and Brian Houston stayed for a week with his family because he was apparently a traveling preacher. And he was like, oh, no. They did shut this man eventually. At first, I just heard his voice. Okay, so he said Pastor Frank would creep into the room late at night. No, this was a woman. Sorry. Okay, it was an anonymous woman from February 1970. And she said Frank and Brian Houston, I'm sure they're probably around the same age or whatever. And she said Pastor Frank would creep into the room late at night, and then she would wake up and he would just be standing over her. Like, the fact that he was waiting for her to wake up and know his face is weird. And he wouldn't leave the room. And then one of the people they were interviewing said, well, the exact same thing happened to me as a kid. And the person was labeled a former congregant. He said, and as a kid, he would creep into my room late at night. He said, and it was almost like he couldn't decide whether it was real or not. And whenever trauma happens, people can bristle to the point where they don't even want to believe it. And he said, I refer to it as the black shadow. And one person said they finally told their mother about it when they were about 16 or 17. So this is after the abuse. And the mom was still involved in the church. And the mother told this particular boy, man that's telling the story, but he was 16 or 17, said that you don't want to be responsible for turning people away from the church and leading them into hell, apparently by telling the truth. And I just said to myself, besides the obvious, right, how manipulative religion can be. Because I can tell you right now, the woman who said that, she believed it. She believed what she said to her son that invalidated his entire story. And that's scary. So then we had the religious historian who said that she was surprised at how much the evangelicals emphasized authority over people, especially the authority of the church leader who they claim God put on earth. She said she was really shocked at that level of authority. And I was like, how did you manage to become a religious historian and the level of authority by ministers or people in leadership in the church was shocking to you? None of that shocked me. None of it. But okay, girl. Anyway, and that kind of thing, people weaponize their position in the church to justify their behavior, or they can. I mean, not everybody, you know. And most people are, you know, religious and dedicated and pious, but the people that are bad just are often just really damn bad. So anyway, so the stories of abuse survivors led to the parents being thrown out of the church when some of them actually told and addressed it, basically for challenging Frank Houston. So one boy came into the church one day and he said what Frank Houston had done, which was apparently sexually molesting him. And they said, and this was a boy, okay, under the age of 18. I don't know how old he was, but he came into the church that day and basically said, I guess, Reverend Frank Houston, sexually abused me. And a grown man punched him in the face. A grown man did this to a boy and said for him not to ever talk about their pastor again. Can you imagine how traumatizing that is? And the reaction isn't, oh, be quiet, oh, what's wrong? Why are you saying this? Not that. To physically assault this person and keep them quiet. And I feel like people who behave like that, one, you clearly have no boundaries with a child. But what are you hiding that's your reaction? So trouble starts in November 1998 for Brian and Frank Houston. I said, this shit goes back to fucking 1998? What the fuck have y'all been doing in Australia? All right, anyway, so this went on for nearly a decade and a half, and I was doing the math as I watched. A decade and a half before this royal commission rolled out in 2014. Huh? Anyway, child. So when someone came out, and I told you Frank went on a holiday, okay, or 2 holidays for like 2 Sundays because this information came out. All of a sudden, after this information comes out about some boys saying that he sexually molested them, he hands the keys and a leadership position over to Brian Houston, his son, who's now in charge. So in the deposition, Brian said his father admitted to fondling genitals of one child. And in the deposition, people asked him, well, were there more? And he said they only talked about it once, and his father said it was a one-off. Brian Houston stuck to this story. There were no minutes or records, just what Brian remembers. The fact that you and your son even had this conversation is alarming. And that you and your father had this conversation and you could actually think that a man fondling a little boy's genitals was something to even shirk. Even if it happened once, we know it didn't. But even if it only happened once, to shirk it off like this, there's something wrong with you. And this is some bullshit. So journalists started going back into Frank's life, and the reason why they were like, because everything is so hard to get to because so many people, are protecting the Hillsong Church, the NDAs that I was telling you about earlier. So they went back into the Salvation Army's boys' home in the 1950s. That's how far this motherfucker went back with this shit. And he said they told him that there were accusations even on the books from the Salvation Army. That shit didn't become public knowledge until 2003. Frank Houston had been accused of sexually fondling, abusing children in the 1950s when people weren't even necessarily aware of these kind of things to make law. You know what I mean? It wasn't that kind of talking about it. That was recorded on the books. And then somebody with that kind of notoriety in Australia, this isn't even made public knowledge until 2003. Hell, a man died in 2004. Must be nice to continue fucking up people's lives. That shit, I said, y'all, ain't that about a bitch? So Frank Houston traveled a lot, and we know why. They were like, well, he would go into poor neighborhoods and preach, and he essentially would take advantage and purposely, like a predator, go to places where people were socially isolated because of their class, even their race, like I'm presuming like even in those Aboriginal communities where people don't get legal protection because of their race. Bottom line, okay? Australia's racist, okay? Just like United States racist, okay? So anyway, and I'm thinking to myself, this motherfucker is a real danger to society, and he stays on the move doing this shit. So the Hillsong Church decided it was a serious moral failure on the part of Frank Houston that he had a moral transgression instead of describing it as a series of violent acts against children. That's the same thing Carlin's got fired for. And I don't remember what review I said this in. And like I said, I'm not defending that charlatan for his charlatanness. But my thing is, if Laura and Carl Lentz were molesting children, I would feel differently. Had he raped a woman, I would feel differently. Y'all up here mad at him for cheating on his wife and kick him out. And then people like the guy in Dallas who raped a woman and this motherfucker who has been molesting children, these are just moral failures. But it all goes under the same umbrella. No, 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 no. Crimes have rankings for a reason. The fuck out of here. So one of the victims said he met Frank as a grown adult at McDonald's. Frank got in contact with him after he came out about his sexual abuse. And the man, their interview, he has to be in like his 50s or 60s, recalling the story. And he said Frank Houston, who had sexually abused him, said after he came out, he said, look, I want you to forgive me. Admitted to it. And this is at a McDonald's. The first thing that went off in my head was how fucking R. Kelly was always picking out and choosing girls, high school girls, at the McDonald's, and boys, we know now, at the McDonald's. Why? Because those are places where a lot of young kids go. Why? Because that's the kind of shit you can afford in high school and middle school. And I was like, these people are sick. McDonald's, this ain't looking good. But he kept emphasizing to this grown man after he violated him that he needs to forgive him, right? Never mind the harm he did. So he said so the man said he signed a food stain napkin where Frank Houston basically wrote $10,000 on the napkin for leaving it alone and said, I'll pay you this if you leave it alone and forgive me, whatever. So apparently a while went by, several weeks went by, and it took a while. So the man reached out to Brian Houston. He said, well, your father promised me this money. He didn't follow up. So Brian Houston sends the payout, but he told the man, he said, it was your fault for tempting my father. That man had tears in his eyes. This grown man in his 50s to 60s had tears in his eyes because this man told him it was his fault for tempting his father as a little boy. Way to reinforce the abuse, you low down, dirty bastard. Anyway, so then the immediate next step was Brian Houston rebranding the whole church. Not bringing in counselors, not trying to take account of whatever may have happened in the church so that they can move forward with the will of God. Why? Because this is not about the will of God. This is about making money and having control, especially when you've been a lame ass person your whole fucking life, Brian Houston. All right? So that same year, they wheel out his father, who dies in 2004, but he's still alive at the time. The same year he's paying this man off with $10,000. Other people have come out about the sexual abuse. They wheel his father out on stage, one of their mega church stages, and his son introduces him as a real apostle of God, and the huge crowd of this mega church stands up and applauds him. An admitted pedophile and child rapist, and you have thousands of people at this mega church standing up and applauding this man. Like I said, the Eddie Long thing. It's that cult-like thinking. So Dr. Gordon Lee was a doctor who basically had diagnosed Frank Houston with like Alzheimer's or dementia, something like that. And so, well, he couldn't remember those incidents anyway. Now, people said the diagnosis is suspicious because he had been hired by Brian Houston to make this diagnosis. First of all, if you know anything about Alzheimer's or dementia, and I know because of people I've had in my family that have dealt with it, you actually go back to your younger years, even your younger adult years. That's actually where your memory goes back to. So he could actually have admitted to that even with that. So to say he just forgot, it's some bullshit. All right, then the main person handling all these accusations, handling the PR and shit for it, was Brian Houston. And so people are like, it was a conflict of interest. Even in the deposition, he said, well, it never occurred to me until I came before this royal commission. This is what he's saying in the deposition. Bullshit. Okay, Brian said he never preached again. His father never preached again after that because of the accusations. But they literally have recordings. He was still preaching after that. First of all, you know he's guilty when he hurries up and hands the keys and everything over to his son. Okay, but he can't remember shit. He got Alzheimer's and dementia. I tell you what, but his mind was working for that. Fuck out of here. They played the recording of him speaking and preaching in churches. So in the recording, apparently you can hear his voice, and he pointed out two boys in the back of the church, and he's commenting on these little boys' looks. Now, I'm not saying that adults can go, oh, hey, handsome, or something like that. You know, like in the black, we hear people talk like that. But that's not what I'm talking about. Okay? Let me be clear. In the back of the church, he's commenting on how the boy looks and how good looking he was. Even after these allegations, she was like, you can't help that you're so cute or so beautiful. You know, God gave it to you. There's nothing like already like grooming these kids like feel good in an environment like where people are kind of like okay with it. Like that's weird. He's sick as fuck. You doing this after the allegations come out publicly? Get out of here. So when he admitted before the congregation, Brian Houston that is, that his father was accused of being a pedophile, but he still believes and is doing, Brian Houston said, I still believe that I am doing what I do because of Jesus. You know, and approximately 12,000 people were there, and they stood on their feet and applauded him for the fuck shit. So according to Carl Lentz, he said the way Hillsong has dealt with scandal typically, I was like, well, damn, how many of y'all had? With scandal is to push it as far down as it would go, to push it as far under a rug that you could get it. He said all they did was acknowledge it, but nothing was done. And before I could even go in on Carl Lentz too far, he goes, I know it. I know because I've been a part of it. And I was like, okay. See, that's important to say. Now you ain't got much to lose, bruh. So you might as well come out with all of it. So the Royal Commission had finally exposed the institutional child sexual abuse. Okay. Got the information, got the depositions. All they did was acknowledge it. Nothing was done. Those people who came out gave their stories a very vulnerable and shameful and painful experience that people never get over. You find ways to cope and be better. If you have a good therapist and have help and support, that never goes away. And as the senator in parliament pointed out, he was like, this wasn't a hard case. He was like, sometimes trying to figure out where drug smuggling begins because it's a global enterprise, trying to find out how somebody snuck it in, how they got it passed, who's part of it. He said, they have evidence and actual admission of guilt. He was like, there was no reason why these people shouldn't have been punished. And then they started in the documentary showing the connections to Hillsong with politicians and the police and, you know, like people like that are high ranking. And meanwhile, a victim comes out to the public again about the sexual abuse of Hillsong. At the same time, Brian Houston is invited to the White House under Trump, even as these allegations are continuing to come out. He still invites him from Australia. Okay? The same motherfucker who was involved with Jeffrey Epstein. Okay? Trump. And this is what I mean. This whole global enterprise and all this other shit, there's a whole lot of people involved in this sick stuff. Hillsong did not respond to multiple interview requests, is what they said at the end of the documentary. And Brian Houston in particular said because of ongoing legal issues. I said, these people are too much. But for some reason, I'm still intrigued. Something also makes me think they done paid off FX that they did the last 2 episodes of this 4-part series. And I got to still do research papers or whatever, still continue grading. But anyway, I'll talk to y'all later. And once again, thank you to all of you who have subscribed. Talk to you soon. Bye.